everybody. Welcome to the first episode of the Future Fossils podcast. This is co-host Michael Garfield, and
I'm Evan Snyder, and we are here today to talk about the idea behind our show moving forward, which is the Future Fossil. And speaking of future fossils, happy birthday, Michael Garfield. I hear it's your solar return today.
Indeed, sir. Friday, January 8th, 2016. Start date, my 32nd birthday. So this is quite a present to finally launch the first podcast that I actually get to be on the giving end for. This has been a long time in coming, even after we announced that we were going to do it. So this is a treat. And I just want to say, start off by means of framing this, that for me, I know, Evan, I know that you have a very different view on this. He sent me extensive show notes for this about all sorts of amazing things with like 15 different links. It's homework. I'm gonna spend all weekend looking this stuff up.
That was the idea. No, for your birthday,
for me,
homework.
I'm kind of coming at this more spontaneously. I am a paleontologist by training, and I spend a lot of time thinking about the remains that we leave as a species. We're living in a time, the recently named stratigraphic period, a geological period in Earth's history called the Anthropocene, which is the human age. And what this means for us to name this is that we have moved into a period where we acknowledge that human beings are a force of geology on this planet, that we are something that the planet is doing, and that we're leaving, consequently, a mark on this world, whether that's through the radioactive isotopes of our nuclear testing, or through the miles and miles of concrete that we're paving over things, the carbon dioxide ratios that are getting frozen into polar ice caps, and all these little ways that for thousands or millions of years from now, there will be a record of human beings on this planet as something that was here. No matter what happens to us, the future of the species, we are an action of geology, where the mineral realm come to life and speaking to itself. So I think that this acknowledgement, this point of view, has a kind of moral injunction. It makes demands on us to see things this way. And the demand is that we start thinking about and taking responsibility for the effect that we're going to have on the distant generations of the future and the life that comes after us, whether that's human or not. So, that's, for me, there's something kind of beautiful also about making, the best possible recordings that we can of the conversations we have about this subject, because these recordings are themselves a kind of fossil, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of life they take on in their own right, in the same way that, for example, a fossil dinosaur kind of takes on a second life when it's discovered and mounted in a museum and people are able to establish a relationship with this creature.
Right.
So you are the museum goers, listeners, and we are the dinosaur.
We're all dinosaurs in one way or another as well, and museum goers. But for all you out there that are listening to this at one point or another, feel free to send in your suggestions for ideas or topics that relate in any way to what we're talking about. When I was a kid, for example, my grandpa would send my brothers and I all birthday presents for each one of our birthdays. So, say, for example, for my older brother's birthday, my younger brother and I would also get presents. So it kind of neutralized, but also, I guess, more aptly unified the idea of like a shared spiral or solar return. So, your birthday right now is my birthday with respect to January 8th last year.
I was reflecting on this, looking at a picture book in a cafe here in Austin, Texas, on the work of the bizarre Dutch kind of proto-visionary painter Hieronymus Bosch.
Yeah.
And it noted in his biography in that book the also all too familiar C next to the date of his birth. Like, they don't really know whether he was born in that year or not because proper records were not kept.
Right.
At that time, and it reflects really the level of resolution with which we were even considering time. That people at that time, we didn't have synchronized clocks. The whole notion of the pendulum and measuring things down to the second. Clocks at the time were off by about half an hour a day every day, and so every city had its own time.
Yeah.
And so you don't really, my birth certificate says I was born at 11:04 p.m. But now, I think people can measure it down to the second because somebody's filming the birth on their Google Glass or whatever.
Yeah.
And in that sense, there's a granularity here that I think can be explored if we take it down a step and actually suggest that we remind ourselves that we're made out of these particles that are kind of bubbling out of the froth of quantum interactions, kind of buzzing into reality out of the collision of virtual particles. And so really in every instant, every bit of us is constantly dissolved and reformed at a level below the threshold of our perception. And so every moment is this opportunity for renewal and regeneration and reevaluation of our lives. And the only thing that's kind of keeping us in the pattern of being, keep this momentum of what has come before. But like we really have, I think the more we meditate upon the idea that we're basically constantly destroyed and recreated spontaneously through no effort of our own, the more we can appreciate that every moment has the potential, at least, to be a kind of rebirth, and that there's that every day is the beginning of a new year, and that these cycles that we share and that we identify culturally as relevant cycles, there's some flex in there. We can mark every moment as the first moment of the universe in some respect.
Yeah, and speaking of which, if your birthday, and you said around 11 p.m., correct?
Yes, sir.
Was indeed at that time on January 8th, back in, would it be 1984? Same
Yes,
as
sir.
me? That it is not actually technically your birthday yet. If we are going strictly by the Gregorian calendar and new sort of Greenwich Mean Time system, I was preemptive in saying happy birthday, and I think the rest of us here in Radio Land and Podcast Land can agree that your time has not quite arrived yet, my friend, but this is certainly the time for meditation and reflection and shared co-creation, so I'm glad to share that with you. And to everybody else back listening in, I'm looking at a bunch of fossils that I actually put right in front of the iMac screen here, just to reflect on myself. And I'll post photos if there's a demand for that, but I got from left to right some broken pottery from Hopi origin that still has ink markings and designs actually on the pieces of ceramic, and then a extinct species of snail that has actually been fossilized in a crystal of chalcedony, so it's a transparent orange. And then a, let's see, petrified wood, or basically a fossilized tree, which is fossilized in almost pure agate form, so it's a very transparent quartz with coloration of green. Then a trilobite, which is my first one I ever picked up, that I was waiting for a long time because I wanted to catch a trilobite, which for anybody knows or doesn't, is a relative of the modern horseshoe crab. Which I'm sure we'll talk about sometime soon as the example of a living fossil. And Michael, you know what I'm talking about there.
Yes, sir.
But I wanted to catch this trilobite because it is in action pose. It's kind of bending over this rock, and you can see it as it's basically moving over this particular ridge at about a 90 or 100 degree angle. And then a fossilized, let's see, what would this one be? A sea urchin, actually, a tiny sea urchin. So I can see the little legs and feet at the bottom of it. And then a relative of what we look at now as a nautilus. an agate, which inside has a bubble of water that's quite sizable. It's an anhydro agate, so it has a bit of water inside, and it's a good enough quantity so that when you shake it, it gloshes about a little bit. And Michael, I think I might have shown you one of these specimens actually at a festival a couple of years ago. I can't quite recall, but if I haven't yet, I need to send you one because they're really cool. The water inside is so old, I'm afraid to break it because I feel like I might unleash some like, Andromeda strain shit. And for anybody listening, I probably will swear.
Fossil plague.
Yeah. Mind my language. I apologize ahead of time. I tend to be a bit blunt when it comes to saying whatever's on my mind. So the very last fossil, though, is a clamshell that was fossilized into multiple materials, including a crystallized calcite that emerged out of the flesh of the clam. The shell itself is fossilized as the shell, but if you look inside, there's these transparent yellow crystals that were once biomaterials. So that's my own reflection material at the time of your near birthday.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I as far as my compliment to this, I am holding in my hand a 7-pound point of smoky quartz, and then right in front of that, one of the most beautiful and delicate and complicated crystals I have ever seen, my 2012 MacBook Pro, which is every bit an epiphenomenon of the mineral processes of our world as they come awake as human beings. And I think, in the sense that, visionary artist Android Jones, who's somebody that I hope to have on the podcast here soon,
definitely,
describes himself as an electro-mineralist artist. He lists this as a school of art, in the way that surrealism or fantastic realism is a school, which I think is beautiful because of its emphasis on the materiality of the artist and the materiality of the artist's media, that, we are made of these elemental forces, and we don't represent, we are literally the quickening of these material forces as they organize themselves into complex patterns in order to disseminate energy and information through the cosmos in the most efficient pattern. So, contrary to, possibly some people's personal experience of life is actually, the best possible flow path of the river of destiny down the mountain of all possible worlds. And, you and I, listeners and co-hosts, we represent that. So while we're on the subject of invoking particular specimens, particular fossils to bring in this inaugural conversation, I want to talk about the fighting dinosaurs. This is a specific fossil that I'm totally in love with and probably will have tattooed on me someday. It was discovered in Mongolia, outside of Ulaanbaatar, in the 1980s by a Russian expedition back when the Cold War was still going on, and American paleontologists couldn't get into Soviet countries or communist countries to do research. So this Russian team goes into what is now considered this is a term we got at least one vocabulary word per podcast. This one's a good one to start with. It's a Lagerstätte. It's a German word. I think I'm saying it right. Lagerstätte. Correct us, please. That means it's an unusually excellent deposit of fossil materials. It's a place where things are preserved exquisitely, unimaginably well. And there are a few of these through the world, and one of them is in Mongolia. And in this place, sandstorms buried these dinosaurs before they had a chance to rot, and very rapidly. So there's a few instances where dinosaurs have been preserved sitting on their nests, brooding their eggs. And in one particular case, the fighting dinosaurs, this fossil of a velociraptor fighting a protoceratops to the death when they were buried by a sandstorm is one of the most beautiful and poignant and incredible things that I've ever had the opportunity to see in person. It's only about 4 feet square, 4 feet to a side.
Yeah.
But these two critters that have their claws buried in each other's now invisible flesh, they're biting each other, and it's this incredible, Mortal Kombat. But whatever was going on for the entire lives of these animals is irrelevant to that snapshot of that one extraordinary moment. And I think that that's like, in a way, that's a really profound metaphor for what each of us have, like in terms of how we will be appraised or experienced by the future, that, we're only going to leave behind so much. And there's the sense that, in the same way that the last scene of the movie kind of changes the way that you walk out of the theater, it kind of, it creates a tone that leaves you with this particular experience as you walk out and back into your life.
Yeah.
That there's this sense in which, we don't, most of the conditions of the life of Hieronymus Bosch are, irrelevant to most people's appreciation of the few, the pieces of work that he left behind for us. And so this issue of fossilization is not only about it's about legacy, but it's about the way that time winnows away things and reduces things and abstracts them.
Yeah, and what we have right now, what we actually have as our current record running, and what we have yet to uncover in that record that may still be substantiative and essential to our understanding of our world and ourselves. The fossil record is somewhat chronological, occupies all niches of time, as far as I can tell, in that its utility transcends time by definition.
Yeah, but then again, the fossil record is itself, in a sense, kind of a living document, because things are always eroding out of the ground and being metamorphized by geological forces, the pressures of things. So, for example, we don't have sedimentary rock with actual physical fossils of bacteria dating more than about 4 billion years ago, because the rock doesn't, there is no sedimentary rock older than that. It's all been worked over and chewed up by the planet's, the tectonic plates,
subduction
squeezing
and
up.
abduction zones, etc.
Yeah. So, in that sense, that this returns us to this issue of the urgency of the attention to which we, the attention that we offer to the whatever it is that we leave behind. That if we really want it to last, we have to be aware of these larger cycles and these larger forces that are at play. For example, this for me, this podcast is very deeply and profoundly inspired, and I know I will be bringing this up time and time again, by the Long Now Foundation out in California, and their efforts to get people to think about very long timescales by building a clock that they want to last for 10,000 years. That will actually tell time over these vast time periods, where the second hand is actually a day, and it ticks once a day. And in order to build this clock, they have to find a place, and they found one in West Texas, where where it's geologically stable enough that an earthquake or volcanic eruption isn't going to destroy the site of their construction. So it's like a lot of this is, if we are intending to build a legacy, if we really want to give any thought to what it is that we're leaving behind, then we have to think about, the foundation upon which we're building it. And, that draws us not only deeper into time, but deeper into this very visceral, palpable, material, physical relationship with our surroundings and the practical realities within which we are embedded on a day-to-day basis, but tend to forget due to Adult Swim and girl problems and car repairs.
Yeah, exactly. I would say that the nomenclature of the foundation of the Long Now is not irrelevant in the conversation, because the foundation itself being a significant implication for the purpose of the organization. Laying down a 10,000-year clock also requires a inception point or year zero on that clock itself. So, as far as I know, although they've managed to secure the land rights and have worked out the engineering of the device itself, which is absolutely fascinating, and I highly recommend anybody listening to Google the long now and or the 10,000 year clock and scope out how this thing works, because it has been deeply thought through by some of the best minds, mechanical engineers, and people who are experts in cogs for tiny clock apparatus like watches. It is a work of art and genius, and could genuinely last 10,000 years. My only qualm with the idea itself, and I like the idea of having a single qualm, keeping it at that instead of having qualms, in plural. It's kind of a take on Scott Aukerman's Comedy Bang Bang segment, qualm in the singular. Being preferential, but like my only qualm with the idea of the 10,000 year clock is while we may be able to out-engineer geology to some extent and meteorology to another small extent, human beings are somewhat of a wild card. So I would first and foremost be cautionary with respect to the design of the apparatus itself, with respect to human beings and their interference or interface with it. And as far as I can see, its recharging mechanism depends somewhat on human power, recharging and rewinding the mechanism. So I feel that might be the weak link in the chain, unfortunately. Somewhat of a misanthropic idea, which is, a skeptical eye towards humanity, but I feel like we could be the wild card.
Then again, the long now also has... this question, like they ran a series of plenary presentations, and the first speaker that they had present was Neil Gaiman, the author who gave a talk on how to make a story last.
Yeah, the author of Sandman and the author of Coraline also, I believe.
Right, yeah. So, and one of the things that I think is actually mentioned in Stuart Brand's book about the 10,000 year clock is about how, in order to maintain this device, you basically have to start a religion that, in some sense, that you have to create a cultural machine that will endure, that in order to, so that the care and the concern for this idea is passed down through the generations, and that there will be people there to wind the clock.
Right.
That's very much the case with the science fiction series that I've been totally geeking out on super hard lately, which is John C. Wright's Count to the Eschaton.
Yeah.
Those of you familiar with Terence McKenna's work will know that the eschaton is the transcendental object at the end of time, and that there's this sense, this thread through the work of science fiction, early science fiction luminary Olaf Stapledon, his work, The Star Maker. And then also in the work of Jesuit mystical paleontologist and like one of my patron saints, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, that all of these complexifying forces in the universe are leading up to this sort of apotheosis at the end of time, where all of the universe has joined into one giant consciousness. And so in John C. Wright's series, he has his protagonist decode an alien monument we find orbiting another star, and the monument contains a mathematics that determines the interactions between species when they encounter one another, and that because of the vast distances required to travel in order to communicate directly, face to face, as it were, that there's certain energy budgets involved, and vast economic expenditures, and that basically the protagonist decides or discovers that by decoding this monument, they have alerted this other race to our presence on Earth, and now the clock is ticking, to 8,000 years in the future when they finally arrive, traveling at the just below light speed.
I love it. That's awesome.
And so he has this problem, which is, how do we prove to this race 8,000 years from now, that we are sophisticated enough to participate in what amounts to basically the Galactic Federation, that we are actually a starfaring race. And so he and the other characters, the whole drama of that series is around how to properly prepare for something that no one alive today will actually live to see. And like, how do we create a starfaring society? How do we prepare the ground for the future generations of human beings to, like, how do we steer the course of history so that there is a braking laser in orbit that will actually receive this alien craft when it arrives? You know, and it's like, this is...
Indeed, yeah. I think, like, sorry to interrupt, I know it's your birthday and everything, so therefore my interruption cost is at 200% or above. I will sacrifice the Bitcoin for you. But the idea of the eschaton, or what Terence McKenna also referred to as the strange attractor at the end of history, that idea. It's a highfalutin title, to say the least. But I felt it was an interesting phraseology to utilize in the poetic sense. But the idea of the strange attractor at the end of history, in a way, doesn't nullify or eliminate the energy we put into pushing our species and our world and our reality forward and keeping it alive, keeping multiple systems, multiple life forms, ideally all life forms, if possible, alive and thriving. That is somewhat assumptive on the belief that we are moving on, what Zeno would have referred to, and Zeno referring back to the philosopher and mathematician, as a paradox, or as time's arrow, that we are moving forward irreversibly in time, that the past ultimately results in the consequences that come out and emerge into the future and into our reality. And maybe that isn't so. Maybe we're actually being reverse engineered in that sense. Maybe the eschaton, or the strange attractor at the end of whatever time is actually pulling us forward versus asking us to come towards it.
There is quite a bit of evidence for retrocausation, or like time negative causal influence, that's coming out of a number of different fields, one of which is engineering and one of which is psychological experiments. And that for 27 years, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab investigated stuff like this, and for at least some of that tenure, investigated specifically the issue of retrocausation and found statistically significant evidence that this is the case.
Yeah.
So there is that. But I also want to point out, that it has to be said that I don't think that the as Terence put it, that physicists ask for us to give them one miracle, the Big Bang, the singularity at the beginning of time, in order to explain everything. And they say, give us that one miracle and we can cover everything else. I was like, I think the same is, it's equally and oppositely true. Although McKenna was such a trickster that I don't know that in any of his recordings that I've ever heard that he actually ever fessed up to this. But a singularity at the end of time is every bit as miraculous and ridiculous, ultimately, and that these seem to be, in some sense, perspectival illusions. That what we're dealing with here is maybe we needed the idea of a strange attractor at the end of time to counterbalance the idea of a Big Bang and resolve this issue of the conservation of momentum, and that what we actually have is more of a like a relativistic or horizon type effect, where we are looking, the farther back we look forward, or the farther we look behind us, quote unquote, to spatialize our experience of time, which is, I think, something that, another thing we ought to call ourselves out on, time and the way that we spatialize past, present, future with our language. But that these are sort of equal and opposite horizons. One is because we live on a planet that rotates, we talk about sun, rising in the east and setting in the west. And so we have this we have this very spatial understanding of time. So to say that the Big Bang is in one direction, but it's like the sun is not actually rotating around us, right? So we may actually be observing one object from two different perspectives.
True.
And that the end of the universe and the beginning of the universe are actually the same moment, and that this calls for a total reevaluation of this sort of bonkers optical illusion insanity that time is linear, or that time is even circular.
Yeah,
there's something beyond those two sort of limited interpretations.
It's not just a total reevaluation. It, in a way, is just adding a dimension, which is this sort of axial projection of the path of, say, the sun with respect to the orbital pattern of the Earth. That the circular and elliptical nature of the Earth's orbit around the sun is essential in the overall equation, but the trajectory and the velocity of the sun as it proceeds throughout the galaxy, and indeed the galaxy's velocity and trajectory throughout the universe, is also significant when calculating relativistic speeds and comparisons between other, especially galaxies and other like globular cluster type phenomena. So that is an interesting intersection with respect to, say, your birthday, which is that we're at the same rotational perspective as we were overall compared to January 8th of 2015, but we are at a fundamentally different point in space-time, in that we have repeatedly shot forward like a bullet and then some into interstellar space, and we are a lot farther from where we were. So overall, in the past year, you've moved a very long distance, and we can pull some numbers in the description or notes for this podcast moving forward. But you've hurdled a significant number of miles, to put it mildly.
Yeah, it's something like the Earth travels several million. I think it's like 6 million miles a day through space.
That would make sense. Yeah.
I'm going to throw a lot of, I'm just warning you, Evan, I'm going to throw a lot of off-the-cuff measures and numbers and paraphrases out in this podcast. Guys, this is not something that we've thoroughly discussed going in. We have somebody who's on one end, Evan's a very structured and diligent sound engineer, and I'm a totally maniacal musical improviser. So that'll probably be reflected in our conversations.
Yeah. The overall orbital period of the galaxy with respect to our sun is 225 million years. That is the time it takes for our sun to move all the way around the galaxy as it turns. And as some of you may know out there, our Milky Way is what is referred to as a spiral galaxy, which has several arms, and we are kind of in the outer arm of one of the tiny sections of our Milky Way, which is fairly incredible considering that we're actually on impact to a nearby galaxy as well, coming up maybe in the next few billion years. So
you're getting it on.
Yeah,
Milky Way and Andromeda. Make some babies.
Interface that Andromeda, that's right. So one other thing I wanted to mention, though, is the idea that you mentioned earlier of fossilization and moving forward into the eschaton or to the strange attractor of the end of history. I feel that idea, the strange attractor or the eschaton itself being somewhat of an inverse and equal and opposite reaction to the idea of the Big Bang, is consistent with the idea of the Big Bounce, which is that as soon as the universe reaches the end of its lifespan and contracts, that it in fact explodes outwards again into the next Big Bang. And it's merely an oscillation that we're witnessing as sort of this year zero phenomena, that instead of the year being factually reset to zero, we're merely bouncing back and forth between a zero axis on say, the x-axis of a graph, looking at a sine wave moving forward on that x dimension. That is one explanation for the idea of a Big Bang, but again, for me personally, it feels like an incomplete tactic, that there is something missing with respect to my intuition on what is happening, and we may never know what that is.
Yeah, we are only merely humans after all. A friend of mine was saying last night, and I don't know that this is directly related to the issue of time, although we can try and take it there, that, in his experience working with the psychedelic medicine ayahuasca, that he became convinced that we are basically just koi in a koi pond that have no idea of the human world beyond the boundaries of the pond, and that there's that koi have no concept of brake pads or high schools or any of these things, and that it's essentially in the same way that we moved from an Earth-centric to a solar-centric model of the solar system a few hundred years ago, that we may be moving from a human cognition, deeply and painfully anthropocentric view of mind and life and the cosmos into one that acknowledges that as a sort of universal basis for the correlation of experience and description of mind and body as the internal and external experience of what it means of being, such that we are able to arrive at sort of a basic theory of consciousness and of anatomy as distinct perspectives on or rather mind and body as distinct perspectives on consciousness, and that in light of that we may decide that we want to go back and reclaim some of these more pre-modern ancient worldviews that we have abandoned when we moved into a scientific paradigm that was not yet able to investigate these things at the level of rigor that was required in order to observe them, namely that the vastly intricate electromagnetic patterns observable in space, generated by stars and planets and nebulae, are actually minds of their own, and that the same kind of correlation that we can make between the electrical activity of the human brain and body and the experience of being human may have some transcendental correlate in these larger celestial bodies, and that in fact we are basically the germs living on some koi that is itself just swimming around in the pond of a galactic consciousness. This is the stuff that gets me off.
Sure.
And
well,
and
fair point.
And is if we are really to if we really are going to answer these great questions, then we're all the way back around to having to address how do we preserve human civilization long enough that we can develop the experimental methodologies required to even embark on this kind of an investigation and communicate with gods, basically.
Sure.
I'm not so much in favor of the idea that the human project is to become gods, because I think that science, in asking more questions than it answers, actually bottoms out into a sacred humility and a mystery, rather than this sort of narcissistic, uber-menschy kind of control paradigm, fetishy nonsense that is so common in the singularitarian community. No offense, listeners, I hope, but I think it is kind of an adultolescent point of view. At any rate, it seems like the real project, what I see converging on the horizon of the future, is we get to a place where science and religion are basically the same thing. It's the same process of exploring the mystery of that which is greater than our ability to understand. And if we really want to give it a college try, we got to think about how we're going to continue to deepen and broaden our ability to pass on our profound inheritance of wealth, wisdom, and knowledge to the generations before us. Taking the long view, take a long enough view. In fact, let's start it right there.
Sure.
Take a long enough view, and I think that you start to see where on the other side of the horizon, all of these lines of latitude and longitude that spider out from the pole that we're standing on of this sphere and meet on the other side of the planet, that when we started to differentiate into different disciplines of human knowledge, that that these things are coming back together, and that there's this sort of synthesis or return in which the holistic human knowledge that was the province of alchemy and pre-modern shamanism and other pre-modern ways of knowing is starting to reintroduce itself to itself, and that, as I see it, probably the completion of the human project and the beginning of the trans or post-human project is one in which science and religion are recognized as equal and opposite vectors arriving at the antipodal moment from the rational decision to divide the how and the why into incommensurable domains, as has been said, that these two things are qualitatively different. And it's like, well, maybe, but they certainly don't seem to be, because they both end up leaving us in the awe and the wonder and the mystery of our smallness and ignorance. The more we know, the more we know we don't know.
Well,
and
that's somewhat the point, isn't it? That both religion and science seek to explain and to rationalize or quantify or turn into a narrative the fundamentals of our existence and our overall path that we all share together and experience as individuals. That we're trying to get to the bottom of why we exist. And in fact, like if you look at the beginning of a lot of scientific inquiry with respect to the funding and overall apparatus and space and time allocated to those who made the first significant scientific discoveries, including Isaac Newton to a good degree, were from the clergy and from religious people of that time. That religion sought to explore scientifically the basis for God and for the dogma or the stories, narrative, and spirituality of religion, to push forward with who we are. And in fact, that became like so dramatically the case that now we're facing this quandary where science seems diametrically opposed to religion, when in fact it was born out of the same origin, which I find to be highly ironic and beautiful. If only people would realize now in our time that is indeed the case. There is a nearly unsolvable or perceivably unsolvable dichotomy and separation between church and state, as it were, which I feel on the constitutional level is benevolent and should be withheld from change as much as possible.
Because bitches be tripping,
Yeah, we should have a separation of church and state. That's awesome. I don't feel like my money should say "In God We Trust," although the idea of money is already absurd, so might as well impose that additional absurdity onto the equation. I do feel that there is some validity, that there is some real validity to religion, as there is some real validity to science, and that's where I feel like whoever you pit Bill Nye against on the religious side, he will ultimately falter, because it is pitched in a falsely dichotomous and sort of inversely related set of dualities that does not in fact exist. And it betrays the reality of our shared situation. I have to answer the door. I'll edit this out if need be, but I'll be right back if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, sure. That was a great moment to emphasize, accentuate your point with a ringing bell. I think, this on the other side of the fence, you got people like Richard Dawkins and Bill Nye, but then you have people like Francis Collins, who is the head of the Human Genome Project, and is a deeply devout believer, is absolutely a Christian for what that's worth, although nowadays that means all sorts of funky postmodern potential things. It doesn't, there's all sorts of ways to interpret that. More ways than there used to be, which again seems to evince the relationship between the moving arrow of time, quote unquote, and the increasing complexity of the biosphere and its the increasing diversity of cultural opportunities and options and fashions and avenues of human expression. And so in that sense, this is the real critical point for me. This is the thing that I feel is most important to bring up in this conversation, and I'm glad that it's kind of led us here, which is that in some sense, the ability that we possess to observe and understand the past is growing with every year. Now, whether this is a cosmic trend or whether this is a recent and regional trend in the landscape of time, I couldn't tell you, but it does seem that if you look at, for example, the ancient city of Catalhayuk, or other ancient cities, the first cities, the cities that we regard as the first cities, had only a few thousand people in them. The Catalhayuk had fewer humans living in that community than were going to my high school. And now there are millions and millions and millions of people that are aware of and discussing these ancient places. And the amount of attention that is trained on them is so vastly more than the amount of attention that was within them at the time. And there's this growing granularity and breadth with which we're able to turn and examine the past. And so I think it's, again, when you look at that trend, I think that there's a kind of a Copernican view that we have to take here, which is that we're not the most aware of all things of this moment. That those of us living here, we may be standing on this, 3 square feet of turf at this time, but that we're leaving all sorts of traces of like the DNA that we shed from our dead skin cells and the digital exhaust that we create with our Google searches and Facebook browser cookies and stuff.
And our shed hair and our excrement.
All of the space trash in orbit. I mean, you can get kind of cynical about it, but everything excretes. So we're leaving behind so much information that we are not capable now of understanding. And it seems that as our ability to observe patterns and make sense of them in a way that's comprehensible to human beings grows, that there will be more people in the future studying this moment now than are studying this moment now.
Yeah.
And that this is, I want to invoke the last major invocation that I have for today is my friend the Tea Fairy, who uses this as a rhetorical line around which she organizes her entire life, because she takes it as almost like the wager of Pascal's wager, that no harm can come of believing that the future is watching, but amazing things can come of believing that the future is watching. Amazing things are possible when you feel a sense of responsibility, even to the entertainment, or but probably more to the the understanding and the wisdom of future generations. And that in that sense, there's something about acting and living as though we are transparent to the future and that we're being watched, that maybe is a holdover from my upbringing, and it's kind of like an adult version of the Santa Claus thing, like don't let the invisible watcher down. Well, maybe I'm projecting my own higher witness observer perspective, the featureless observer that I am, that is not this body, into the future, or maybe it's some combination of all three of those things. But I find it super useful to think about it in this way.
There's definitely a parallel with respect to our perception of future self, which actually interestingly enough, comes into play with respect to epigenetics and the idea that, and now the scientifically verifiable reality, quite likely, that we, in fact, through our daily and overall lifetime experience of different stimuli and choices, in fact, actually hand those genetic traits which are adaptive to those stimuli down to future offspring, and that our choices as individuals could actually have immediate repercussions for our offspring overall. And I feel that is akin to the idea of the spiritual watcher, or the Santa Claus, seeing if you're naughty or nice. Like the idea of like a spirit becomes somewhat interchangeable with the idea of thinking about yourself as a four-dimensional object with respect to the 4D dimension as time. We have length, width, and depth occupying the three spatial dimensions, and then time occupying the fourth dimension. This is definitely an abstraction and is not to be taken as dogma by any means, or as gospel for any theory of everything, but can describe in a way like how we view and how we interrelate to and interface with space-time. The fourth dimension itself as a time aspect of who we are as physical beings changes when we think about ourselves as basically handing down who we are on a daily experiential level to the next generation. Say if we are practicing mindfulness and meditation versus kind of getting stressed out and focusing on things which are extremely material and not at all rewarding to the human essence, our offspring, our children, could be dramatically different depending on that, according to modern epigenetic theory and understanding of heritable traits from one generation of human beings to the other. So maybe a good thing for reflection on your birthday. I don't know, but it seems to be definitely.
Don't drink too much, or your kids will be messed up.
Yeah, or
It's kind of like that, though. Yeah.
Yeah, don't eat poorly. Don't have too much sugar, whatever it is. Your children could very well wind up with the same problems that you had. Stress and I think depression and other aspects of human experience are similar.
But do listen to mind-bending podcasts, because this constant exercise of attention and intellect is definitely going to hand itself down either culturally or genetically or epigenetically in some useful ways.
Sure.
I want to point out, Evan, in bringing up four-dimensional space-time, though, in this call already, we have discussed time as a landscape of more than just that one dimension. We've already discussed time as a spherical landscape.
Definitely.
And it's possible that there is either we can extend this metaphor and explore not just a chronological duration, but the sort of harmonic cycles that are present in the Mayan calendar and in Western and Eastern astrological systems. That there's a kind of a quality, or what the Greeks called a kairos, as opposed to the chronos of just the minutes passing us in stately fashion, one after the other, each every bit as long as the next. That there's a qualitative dimension to it, or an internal flavor to each moment that would provide us with the second axis, and that there may also be a depth, a z-axis to time that has to do with the amount of attention, or the depth of our ability to actually perceive and experience time. And so, the three-dimensional landscape of the spheroid object that we call Earth, that we understand right now as a sphere, it seems that just as we most of us moved from a flat Earth view to a spherical Earth view, that as we learn to integrate these multi-dimensional views of space-time, that we may find that that Earth actually resembles sort of an ecology of nested hyperspheres of all different kinds of organisms having all sorts of different experiences of time.
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, a very interesting topic of its own for an entire set of podcasts, but maybe just one, depending on what we do.
But maybe we've gone too far today.
It's all highly relative. I did want to say, though, as one last point on my kind of peanut gallery side of the stage here, that we may feel inconsequential with respect to our size and our placement in the cosmos. With kind of the perception as being extremely small compared to planets and stars, and especially galaxies and globular clusters, nebulae, whatever else. I guess, though, the more recent research is that we are somewhat in between the galactic universal massive macro scale and the absolutely tiny micro Planck scale of even atomic, subatomic particle behaviors, even down to the quantum foam. So the notion that we're somewhat in the middle as far as scale goes is, for me, deeply humbling, but also deeply empowering, that we are, interestingly enough, placed in our reality in the intermediary fulcrum point of full tininess to full enormousness, and thus have some potential and some ramifications and significance, but not too much. That we are not quite gods by any means, according to our own definition anyway, but we are also not powerless. We are not by any means also particles, although we might be described that way, and we might find increasingly as time goes on that sociology is interchangeable to some extent with quantum mechanics.
Oh, dang, dog.
Oh, drop that one for your birthday. Happy birthday again for the 15th billion time.
So generous.
Well, that's again another podcast topic for its own time, maybe. But I wanted to say thank you for anyone listening to this very topographical conversation on this beautiful day, and it will be interesting to share this with you more and get your input, see where we can go as a collective.
Totally. We love you guys. Thank you so much for listening to this. Stay tuned for future episodes, because we have a list of about 100 people that we want on this show already, and we're only just getting started. Musicians, philosophers, scientists, random weirdos, circus freaks. It's going to be a lot of fun, and we're going to explore this issue of our place in the landscape of the cosmos from as many angles as we possibly can. If you have any recommendations or suggestions or questions, our contact information is included in the show notes, and it'll be super easy to get a hold of us. We are both personable characters, and we really appreciate you listening, and stay tuned next week. We'll have another episode for you.
Not done here, and we may not ever figure it out. We probably won't figure it out.